Hey guys, tonight we're going to start with a number that should not make sense to you. For 8 seasons on one of the most beloved family shows in American television, the woman who played Ma Ingalls earned around $600,000 in total. The man who played Pa walked away from the same years with an estate estimated at about $40 million, roughly 66 times more than his on-screen wife. Now add this. When she finally asked for a raise, he reportedly told the network she wasn't popular enough to deserve it, and compared her pay to the child actors on the show. Tonight, you're not watching the Prairie from the outside. You're going to stand where she stood, in the heat, in the costume, in the space between a smiling close-up and a workplace that slowly taught her how small she was allowed to be. This is the story of Karen Grassle, the classically trained actress behind America's favourite television mother, and what it cost her to challenge Michael Landon at the height of his power. Settle in. You don't have to close your eyes, but let the rest of your day fall a little further away. We're going to walk into this carefully, one quiet step at a time. Yet before you ever feel the weight of a calico dress on your shoulders, you have to understand the life that came before it. So, for a while, you're not in a studio at all. You're in Berkeley, California, in a house where the air is often tight with tension. The girl in that house is bright, serious, and already learning how to read the adults around her the way some children learn to read books, watching for mood shifts, measuring the level of alcohol in a parent's voice. She finds a different kind of safety on a stage. In high school, and then at the University of California, Berkeley, she studies English and dramatic art, with a special love for Shakespeare. She learns how breath works, how posture changes a character, how a line can sound careless or devastating depending on where you put the pause. By 1965, she has a degree in English literature and dramatic art from Berkeley, and something rare for an American actress at the time, a Fulbright fellowship to the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. Imagine stepping into that London building. Cold corridors, wooden floors that remember every footstep. Teachers who have no interest in whether you're charming. They care whether you're precise. She works so hard and so well that years later she returns as head of the voice department, the person other actors come to when they need to learn how to make words carry. This is not a woman who fell into television. This is a woman who built a craft. Next, New York. Small apartments, thin walls, the constant rattle of the subway somewhere under your feet. Karen is doing what stage actors have always done, taking roles wherever they come, measuring her life in rehearsals, opening nights, and closing notices. She makes her Broadway debut in The Gingham Dog in 1969, and even when the run is short, people notice the work. She plays Shakespeare in the Park, Femi sharing stages with actors whose names will later be familiar on movie posters, long before her own face becomes familiar in living rooms. The work is good, the money is not. Theatre gives her respect, but not security. By the early 1970s, television is where steady paychecks are. Not more artistic, not more noble, just more likely to pay the rent on time. So she does what so many theatre actors eventually do. She gets on a plane and heads west. Los Angeles does not greet her with open arms. It greets her with fluorescent-lit casting offices, rooms full of women who all vaguely resemble each other, and the same 5 questions over and over. Age, height, agent, availability. Underneath all that noise, a project is taking shape that sounds, on paper, almost old-fashioned for its time. A family show set in the 1870s. Adapted from a girl's frontier memoirs, a story about log cabins, blizzards, and the idea that if a family loves each other enough, they can make it through anything. NBC calls it Little House on the Prairie. By 1974, Michael Landon is not just another actor in that town. He has spent 14 years as Little Joe Cartwright on Bonanza, receiving more fan mail than anyone else on the cast. Over time, he negotiated something most actors never get, the chance to write and direct as well as act. When Bonanza ends, he does not go back to audition lines. He goes into meetings. He comes out with a deal that gives him a level of control most people in television only dream about. On Little House on the Prairie, he will star as Charles Parr Ingalls, and he will also be an executive producer with budget authority, a director on dozens of episodes, and a writer whose name will be on many of the scripts. In plain terms, he will be the public face of the show and the private engine behind it. He can hire, he can fire, he can decide who gets more to do and who quietly fades toward the edges of the screen. And now he needs a wife, not in real life, on camera. The role of Caroline Ingalls could easily have been written as a background figure, someone who pours the coffee, smiles tolerantly, and leaves the big decisions to the man at the head of the table. But Michael understands something important. If the mother doesn't feel real, the family doesn't feel real. If the family doesn't feel real, the whole show collapses. That is the room Karen walks into. You are there with her. The audition space is plain. Neutral walls, harsh overhead light, a folding chair. Across from you sits Michael Landon. Athletic build, dark hair, eyes that can shift from charming to hard in less than a second. Someone reads lines with you. You play a scene in which a mother has to keep her children calm while the world outside the window feels unsteady. This is where all that training shows. You do not act sweet. You act steady. You drop your voice a little. You let the worry show for half a heartbeat and then bury it, the way real parents do when they know little eyes are watching. Later, in interviews and in her memoir, Karen will say that Michael was kind and sensitive during that audition process, that he directed her gently and helped her find her footing in a medium that was still new to her. She gets the role, and just like that, a woman who has spent years carrying plays in front of a few hundred people a night is about to become the mother of millions. Now you're at Big Sky Ranch, Simi Valley, California, a wide stretch of land dressed up as the Minnesota Prairie. The sun is already high, pressed down on the hills like a heavy hand. You stand inside the set that will become the Ingalls' home. The dress is heavier than it looks on television. The high collar rubs against the base of your throat. Layers of petticoats trap the heat around your legs. The boots are stiff, the kind that leave lines around your ankles by the end of the day. A makeup artist dusts powder over your face, trying to keep the shine under control before you step under the lamps that turn a warm little kitchen into an oven. Outside, you can hear people calling to each other as they drag cables and adjust reflectors. Inside, your job is to make this two-room set feel like a lived-in house. When the director calls action, the space changes. The man next to you is no longer a producer worrying about the next shoot day. He is Pa, tired, kind, already beloved by audiences who remember him from another show. The children become your daughters. Melissa Gilbert, 10 years old, full of energy, as Laura. Melissa Sue Anderson, composed and careful, as Mary. The Greenbush twins taking turns as little Carrie, one on camera while the other rests. You pour coffee. You move around the table, touching shoulders, smoothing hair, putting plates down with the unthinking efficiency of a woman who has done this every morning for years. It looks effortless on screen. It is anything but effortless in your body. Still, in those early days, there is something close to joy in it. The show premieres in March 1974 as a television movie, and by the time the weekly series launches that fall, it is clear that audiences have been waiting for this kind of story. Families sit together in front of their televisions to watch the Ingalls family face grasshopper plagues, hard winters, and small-town dramas with a mixture of grit and tenderness. People write letters saying they see their own mothers in Caroline, steady, tired, loving. Off-screen, Karen is proud of the work. She's also relieved. A series regular job means rent, food, and a little bit of breathing room. On set, Michael is still, for now, the version of himself she met in the audition room. Generous with praise when a scene goes well, attentive to the children, willing to give quiet guidance to an actress adjusting from stage to television. From the outside, it looks like the beginning of a long, healthy collaboration. For a short while, it is. Success changes the air around a show. After the first season, Little House on the Prairie is a solid ratings performer. NBC is pleased. Michael's authority, already considerable, hardens into something close to absolute. This is the moment when Karen makes a decision that, on paper, should be simple. She asks for a raise, not an outrageous one. Not more than the man whose face is on every promotional photo. She asks to be paid in a way that reflects what she actually is, the female lead of a hit series, whose character is central to most of the emotional storytelling, and whose work keeps whole episodes from tipping into sentimentality or melodrama. In a fair world, this triggers a business conversation. Her agent talks to the network, numbers go back and forth. Everyone acknowledges that the show's success depends on more than one person. That is not the world she is in. Behind the scenes, Michael reportedly tells NBC executives that Carolyn Ingalls is not popular enough to justify paying the actress who plays her more money. He compares her value to that of the children, suggesting that her salary should stay in their range. Imagine learning that. You stand beside this man in nearly every family scene. Your character's name is in the opening credits. Your face is in millions of homes every week. And the person who controls your episodes, your close-ups, and your future on the show is telling the people with the checkbook that you simply are not worth much. Karen will later say, very simply, that she felt insulted as his co-star on a hit series. Eventually she does get a raise, but only after a fight that leaves scars. The money improves, the relationship does not. On paper, she wins something. In reality, she has just challenged the one person on that set you're not supposed to challenge. After that, the atmosphere changes in ways that are hard to describe but impossible to miss. And Karen walks into work and feels the warmth thin out. Michael still hits his marks. He still plays tender scenes with her on camera. He still delivers speeches as Pa that bring tears to viewers in living rooms thousands of miles away. But the easy friendliness between takes fades. The distance is subtle at first, a look not returned, a joke you're not invited into, a sense that you're now on the wrong side of a line you never saw being drawn. Then, something else begins. You're back in the makeup trailer. The air is thick with the smell of hairspray and powder. You're in the chair, dress already on, your hair pinned up under a wig cap while a makeup artist works quickly, trying to keep up with the shooting schedule. The door opens, Michael steps inside, he starts talking. Diaz is loud enough for everyone in the cramped space to hear. The words he chooses are not gentle, not professional. He uses a coarse word for a woman's body. He jokes about how a woman smells after sex. He does this in front of crew, in front of other actors, turning your workplace into a place where your body is a punchline. Later, in her memoir and in interviews, Karen will describe feeling frozen in those moments, so accustomed to this kind of treatment in the industry that it did not occur to her to stand up and end it. Think about what that means. A woman who once headed a voice department at a respected drama school. A woman who has crossed oceans to study her craft. A woman whose work is holding up half of every family scene on a hit show. Sitting silent in a chair while the man who controls her career uses her and women like her as material for crude jokes. Then she stands up, smooths her dress, and goes back to set. On screen, Caroline Ingalls looks at her husband with steady affection and stands beside him as an equal partner in the hardest moments of family life. Off-screen, the person playing her has just been reminded very clearly of how unequal their positions really are. For now, pause there. The series is still rising. Viewers at home see none of this. They see the warm kitchen, the lamplight, the way Ma and Pa move in such easy harmony that it feels like the marriage everyone is supposed to want. They do not see the power structure that sits just outside the frame. They do not see how quickly generosity can turn to punishment when a woman on a 1970s television set asks to be paid what she is worth. Karen goes home carrying two versions of herself. The one that millions of people adore, patient, gentle, endlessly understanding, and the one who now knows, without any doubt, that the man playing her husband will use money, jokes, and camera angles to remind her who is in charge. In the next chapter, we're going to stay with her as that shift hardens into years of quiet retaliation, fewer storylines, smaller moments, and a work environment that slowly eats away at her confidence while the show's image stays shining and pure. For tonight, let her sit for a moment in that small trailer, the bonnet off, the powder dusted away, the costume hanging heavy on her shoulders. The audience loves Ma Ingalls. The man who plays Pa Ingalls has just decided how far he's willing to go to keep her in her place, and the woman caught between those two truths has 6 more seasons left on her contract. You already know the raise came with a cost. What you have not felt yet is how long that cost lasted. Because after the arguments were over, after the numbers on the contract finally moved, Karen Grassle still had 6 more seasons of Little House on the Prairie ahead of her. 6 years of walking into work every day knowing that the man who played her husband had told the people in power she wasn't worth much more than the children on the call sheet. The audience at home saw a stable, loving marriage on screen. Karen saw something very different when the cameras turned away. The change shows up first in small, almost deniable ways. You're back on set. Same kitchen, same dress, same children running their lines at the table, but the air feels different. Before the dispute, Michael would joke with you between takes, share small asides about how a line could land better, sometimes lean over the script with you and talk through a scene. Now, there's a chill you can't quite name. The conversations get shorter. The laughter moves a little further down the room. He still gives gifts at Christmas. He still takes some cast members on those famous Hawaiian vacations. He can still be charming, generous, almost impossibly warm, especially with the children. But around you, there is a new distance. You're not fired, you're not screamed at. What happens is quieter. You notice it when you get the next script and your character's scenes feel smaller than the weeks before. You notice it when your storyline, which once carried an episode, now supports someone else's arc. And you really notice it when you're standing in the middle of a scene and the camera simply isn't where it used to be. In her memoir, Karen will later describe the feeling of seeing cameras turned away from her, of realizing that the man directing the episode, often the same man who played her husband, was choosing angles that kept her less central, less visible, less necessary. That is how power works when it wants to hurt you without leaving fingerprints. On paper, nothing is wrong. You still have your name in the opening credits. You still have a contract. You still have fan mail arriving at the studio, letters from women and girls who see Ma Ingalls as the heart of the Ingalls family. But day after day, you show up and feel something being taken from you that you can't hold up as evidence. How do you prove that a close-up that used to be yours now belongs to someone else? How do you demonstrate that a line you might once have spoken with quiet force has been reassigned or cut? From the outside, this still looks like a dream job. From the inside, it is starting to feel like a long, controlled punishment. Karen is a professional. She keeps doing the work. She hits her marks. She brings the same careful emotional weight to every dinner table scene, every bedroom conversation, every moment when Ma steadies the children while Pa struggles outside the door. But she is also human. According to her own later accounts, the hurt and the stress begin to sink in deep enough that she turns more and more often to alcohol to get through the days, and especially the nights. Depression threads through these years, bound tightly to the experience of feeling publicly respected and privately pushed aside. This is the part of the story many women watching will recognize immediately, even if they have never set foot on a set. The meeting where a man smiles and compliments your work while quietly blocking your advancement. The jokes you're expected to laugh at if you want to be seen as a good sport. The way the room can turn on you the moment you ask to be treated fairly. Now imagine doing all of that in front of cameras, knowing that millions of people will see the version of your life where everything looks fine. Michael Landon in these years is not a simple villain. That complexity makes what happens to Karen both harder to explain and harder to fight. Castmates like Alison Arngrim describe him as both generous and stingy. A man who could give lavish gifts and heartfelt support and then, in the same breath, controls salaries so tightly that actors complain bitterly about low pay. Melissa Gilbert remembers him as a loving father figure who took her into his real family's life and made her feel protected. Others recall his capacity for cutting remarks, mockery behind people's backs, and a temper that could end a working relationship overnight. For Karen, the pattern is clear. Before she asked for equal treatment, he was attentive, encouraging, almost protective. After she asked, he stayed charming where it helped him, with the press, with the network, with the actors he preferred, and steadily eroded her professional ground. Because he held so many roles at once — star, executive producer, frequent director and writer — there was no higher authority on that set to appeal to without enormous risk. If she pushes harder, she risks not just her job on Little House, but her reputation in an industry where powerful men talk to each other and women who cause trouble quietly stop getting calls. It is the mid-1970s. The Equal Rights Amendment is being debated in Congress. Second-wave feminism is marching in the streets. But inside this particular corner of Hollywood, the old rules are still very much in force. What makes Karen's story even more striking is what she does with her pain outside the Prairie set. In 1978, while all of this is still going on, she co-writes and stars in a television movie called Battered, a tough, unsentimental drama about 3 women in abusive marriages. The film is one of the earliest network attempts to portray domestic violence, not as a private shame, but as a public crisis. She doesn't just act in it. She helps shape it. She uses her growing name recognition as Ma Ingalls to get a story about women's suffering and survival in front of a mainstream audience. Off-camera, she becomes an advocate for domestic violence shelters and a supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment, showing up in political spaces that have nothing to do with scripted frontier life. Imagine the split in her days. On one set, she's being slowly diminished by a male boss who uses power and humiliation to keep her in her place. On another, she's helping to tell stories that insist women's pain matters and that women deserve safety and equality. She's fighting, in public, for the very things she's being denied in private. For many women in your audience, especially in the United States, that contradiction will feel painfully familiar. Meanwhile, Little House on the Prairie keeps rolling forward. Season after season, the show delivers its blend of hardship and comfort, and Caroline Ingalls remains, in the eyes of viewers, the quiet centre that holds the family together. Behind the scenes, Karen keeps asking for something simple. More meaningful material for her character. Episodes that let Caroline be more than a background presence fixing meals and smoothing sheets. Landon writes, or co-writes, 49 episodes of the series and directs 80 plus. Very few of those scripts centre Caroline. Many of the strongest arcs go to Pa or to the children. When Karen suggests storylines that would give Ma more depth or conflict, they rarely make it to production. Worst of all, from her perspective, is the sense that when she does stand up for herself, the work gets even thinner. There are moments when she looks at the call sheet and realises that, for that week at least, her character has been reduced to a handful of lines that any competent day player could deliver. Moments when she sits on a bench at the edge of the set, waiting for hours to be needed, while the man she once saw as a creative partner commands every camera and every conversation. The audience never knows. They still see Ma at the breakfast table, Ma in the church pew, Ma in the glow of lamplight offering calm words in a crisis. They do not see the hours in between, when Karen sits in her dressing room trying to knit together a sense of worth from fan letters, memories of good work, and the knowledge that she is, or for all practical purposes, trapped. Leaving a hit show is not a simple act of defiance. It is a decision that can end a career, especially for a woman in her 30s and 40s in an industry obsessed with youth and eager to typecast. So, for years, she stays. Staying has a cost. In her memoir and later interviews, Karen speaks openly about how these years fed her alcoholism and depression. She describes behaviour that frightened her, risky choices, and a deepening sense of exhaustion that went far beyond the normal grind of a network series. She does not blame everything on Michael Landon. She takes responsibility for her own choices. But she's clear that the hostile environment, the humiliation, and the constant sense of being undervalued were not just background noise. They were part of the water she was swimming in. Women in your audience know what that kind of water feels like. It is not one big dramatic moment. It is 1,000 small slights, 1,000 quiet wounds, 1,000 days of showing up anyway because the mortgage has to be paid and you work too hard to get here to walk away empty-handed. Still, even in her worst moments, there is a line she does not cross. She keeps the work itself clean. On camera, Caroline Ingalls never becomes a hollow shell. She remains the careful, strong, deeply felt woman millions of viewers still remember. Not a saint, not a caricature, but a mother who is allowed a quiet intelligence and a backbone. That is part of the tragedy and part of the triumph of these years. The more difficult Karen's real life becomes, the more the character she plays becomes a source of comfort and stability for other people. Women watching at home see Ma face humiliation, hardship, and unfairness with dignity. They do not know that the actress playing her is walking through something very similar in a world where she does not always feel dignified at all. Eventually, every long strain breaks somewhere. By the early 1980s, the original shape of Little House on the Prairie is changing. The children are older. The frontier town has gone through fires, tragedies, and miracles. The series is stretching itself with spin-off movies and experiments. At the same time, Karen's role continues to shrink. Her attempts to find satisfying material within the show grow fewer as it becomes clear that the patterns set after the salary dispute are not going to reverse themselves. After season 8, she leaves the series. Officially, it is framed as a natural ending, the end of a long run, a chance to do other things. Behind that neutral language lies nearly a decade of accumulated hurt, hard choices, and a quiet realization that staying any longer would mean losing even more of herself. She does not explode on the way out. There is no televised confrontation, no public accusation, no courtroom. She walks away carrying both the pride of having created one of television's most enduring mothers and the scars of having been treated for years as if her worth could be trimmed down with a single phone call. For a long time, she says almost nothing about what really happened. She keeps her counsel, she works, she fights her way towards sobriety. She builds a life outside of Walnut Grove. The reckoning with Michael Landon comes later. So does the choice to finally tell the full story in public, decades after his death, and long after the show's first fans have become mothers and grandmothers themselves. That part of the journey, the reconciliation, the forgiveness, and the late-in-life decision to break the silence, is where we're heading next. For now, hold this image. A woman in her 40s, walking off a set that millions of people still think of as home. Behind her, the lights of the little house glow as warmly as ever. Inside her, the decision to protect what remains of her own dignity has finally outweighed the fear of letting go. In the next chapter, you'll follow her beyond the prairie, into the years after Little House, into the complex way she and Michael Landon made peace before his death, and into the moment almost half a century later when she chose to put her version of the story on the record at last. Prepared by Deep. She drove away from Big Sky Ranch for the last time in 1982, and the world barely noticed. No press release, no farewell episode, no dramatic final curtain for the woman who had played America's television mother for 8 consecutive seasons. Just a quiet exit from a show that was still running, still popular, and still very much owned, in every sense that mattered, by the man she'd spent years learning to survive. The audience kept watching. The kitchen set stayed warm under the studio lights, and Karen Grassle went home to figure out what came next, carrying a decade's worth of pride, pain, and a sobriety battle she had not yet won. Let's stay with the rawness of that moment before we move forward. Because leaving a hit show is not a clean break. The way it looks from the outside, it doesn't feel like freedom on a Tuesday afternoon when you have been that role, in that costume, in that particular kitchen, for nearly a third of your professional life. It feels like standing in a large room after all the furniture has been removed. Everything echoes. The phone doesn't stop ringing for long. But the calls are different now. Ma Ingalls is what people want, and that is not what she is walking away from. What she is walking away from is harder to explain to a casting director in 2 minutes. There are guest television appearances through the mid-1980s, some television films, a feature film, Harry's War in 1981, made right at the tail end of her Little House years. Murder, she wrote twice, smaller stages, smaller audiences, but the big network series, the kind that carries you into millions of homes every week and gives you the kind of visibility that leads to the next big thing, that door has largely closed, not because she is not talented enough to walk through it. Because Hollywood in the 1980s is still a very small town in the ways that matter, and women who have left powerful men's shows under fraught circumstances do not always find the next door wide open. Guess what she does instead is return to something that was always truer to her instincts than the Prairie set ever was. She goes back to the theatre. In 1988, she works as an understudy on Broadway in Sweet Sue, a production starring Mary Tyler Moore and Lynn Redgrave, two women whose names meant something very specific in that decade: ambition, craft, a refusal to be reduced to background scenery. She helps found a theatre company in Santa Fe, New Mexico called the Resource Theatre Company. She tours in regional productions, including a 2007 run of Driving Miss Daisy, the Pulitzer Prize-winning play. This is not a fall from grace. This is a return to form. For someone whose entire professional identity was built on stage work before NBC ever came calling, going back to live performance is not settling for less. It is reclaiming the version of herself that existed before the calico dress, before the camera, before the salary dispute that changed the temperature of her working life. Still, the years are not easy. The alcoholism that began threading through the latter seasons of Little House does not simply resolve itself because the job changes. Depression runs alongside it. The kind that makes the good days feel thin and the difficult days feel permanent. Karen is working her way through all of that without a public support system, without the kind of platform that allows a celebrity today to turn a struggle into a headline that earns sympathy and speaking fees. She's doing it quietly, the same way she did most things, without announcing herself, without making it a spectacle. In her memoir and in later interviews, she's direct about this part of her life. The dangerous choices, the dark periods, the long and unglamorous process of getting sober and staying that way. She does get sober. That matters, and it deserves to be said plainly. She comes through the other side. Now, something else is happening in these years that's easy to miss if you're only tracking the professional arc. Something quiet and in its own way more significant than anything that happened under the studio lights. Somewhere in the late 1980s, Karen writes Michael Landon a letter. We don't know the exact words. The letter itself is private. But from her later accounts, we know the intention. She was trying to untangle herself from the resentment that had been living in her chest for years, to sort through the hurt and find something that resembled peace. Holding a grudge against someone who controls your professional history is exhausting, in a very specific way. It means he takes up space in your head that you haven't chosen to give him. It means the worst version of your relationship lives rent-free inside you, years after the cameras have stopped rolling. Karen is too self-aware not to see that. They sort things out before his death. She will say later, simply and without drama, "We sorted things out before he passed. I have only forgiveness and appreciation for his gifts and the opportunity that he gave me." That sentence deserves more attention than it usually gets. She does not say he was right. She does not say it didn't happen. She does not revise the story to make him a better man than he was. She says she has forgiveness. Those are two very different things, exonerating someone versus releasing them, and Karen chooses the second. In July 1991, Michael Landon dies of pancreatic cancer. He is 54 years old. The country mourns. The man who played Pa Ingalls, the man who had become one of the most recognizable faces in American television history, is gone in a matter of weeks from the announcement of his diagnosis to the end. The tributes pour in. Cast reunions are organized. The network replays old episodes. His face is on magazine covers wearing the expression that millions of people remember. Warm, strong, slightly amused, absolutely certain. Karen says very little publicly. She has already done what she needed to do. The conversation, whatever form it took in letters or on the phone or in some quiet meeting, had already happened. There is no need to perform grief for a man who caused her real harm, but there is also no need to use a death as a moment for score settling. She chooses neither. She stays private. She stays whole. For the next 30 years, that is where things largely remain. Karen works. She acts in productions across the country. She builds a life that is recognisably hers. Small theatre, community, craft. The kind of work that doesn't come with a Nielsen rating, but does come with the satisfaction of being in a room with a live audience that is paying attention to what you're doing in real time. She stays away from the fan circuit that has grown up around Little House on the Prairie. That show has not faded. If anything, it has only grown more significant as the years pass. New generations of children discover it. Their parents, who watched it as children, watch it again with their own kids, and find that it still lands the same way. Streaming makes it accessible long after reruns stop appearing on local stations. In 2024, the show will have amassed 13 billion minutes of streaming, a number that would have sounded like science fiction when the cameras were rolling at Big Sky Ranch in the 1970s. And yet Karen holds back from the public celebrations, not because she's bitter. She has said clearly that she worked through that, but because the show exists in her memory alongside things that were painful, and the human heart is not a filing cabinet. You cannot open the folder marked Pride without brushing past the folder marked Hurt. She's not ready for a long time to sit at a reunion table and smile as if the full story were already being told. Then something shifts. It is 2020. The world has spent the previous 3 years watching the #MeToo movement force a public reckoning with workplace abuse and gender-based power dynamics in the entertainment industry. Stories that were suppressed for decades are being told. Women who are silenced by fear of professional retaliation are finding that the cultural ground has shifted enough to hold the weight of the truth. Karen is 78 years old. She has been sitting on a manuscript for years, a memoir. Her own account of her own career, her own struggles, her own version of those 8 seasons on the prairie that the world remembers so warmly. She thinks about her audience, the women who watched her as Ma, who sent letters over decades, who named their daughters after the character she built so carefully for so many years. She thinks about the younger women in the industry right now who are facing the same structures, the same calculations, the same quiet choices between speaking up and staying employed. She decides the time is right. Bright Lights, Prairie Dust is published in November 2021. The response surprises even people who have been following her career closely. Readers who expected a warm, nostalgic walk through Prairie memories find instead a clear-eyed, carefully written account of a woman who was systematically undervalued in a role that made other people very rich. A woman who battled alcoholism and depression in silence, while millions of people found comfort in the character she played. A woman who eventually chose forgiveness not because it was required, but because it was the only way to reclaim the space her resentment had occupied. The reviews note something important. She doesn't exaggerate. She doesn't turn Michael Landon into a monster. She presents him as a complex man, brilliant, charismatic, generous in some directions and withholding and cruel in others, and she lets the reader do the moral accounting. That restraint is its own kind of authority. Anyone who has been diminished by a powerful person knows that the temptation is to flatten them, to make them simple enough to hate cleanly. Karen refuses that temptation. Her account is more honest and more useful because of it. In December 2024, Karen Grassle appears at a 50-year anniversary fan event for Little House on the Prairie in Simi Valley, the same location where the original series was filmed. She's 82 years old. She has recently moved to Italy, where she is reconnected with a man she knew long before the Prairie ever called her name. At the fan event, she sits alongside castmates who share decades of history and the particular complicated bond that comes from having spent formative years in an unusual world together. She's warm, engaged, and notably at peace with a past that she spent years carrying alone. Something about that image is worth holding for a moment. The woman who was told she wasn't worth very much, who was compared to child actors when she asked to be paid fairly, who sat silent in a makeup chair absorbing humiliation she couldn't yet name. She is the one sitting in the sunshine at a reunion celebration, surrounded by fans who still love her, still writing her own story. The man who held all the power in 1975 has been gone for more than 30 years. She is still here. At this point in the story, you know the major architecture of Karen Grassle's experience, the training, the casting, the salary dispute, the hostile years on set, the alcoholism and the long climb back out of it, the reconciliation, the silence, the memoir. But there are still two layers we haven't touched. The first is the world around her. The specific landscape of 1970s America, either the second-wave feminist movement that was marching in the streets while the Prairie set kept its old rules firmly in place, and what it meant that the show celebrating ideal American motherhood was simultaneously reproducing the very power imbalances those women were marching against. The second is the evidence, the other voices, what Alison Arngrim said, what Melissa Sue Anderson said, what the production numbers say about how many of those 87 episodes Landon directed featured Caroline Ingalls prominently, and how that changed after 1975. Because the measure of how power works is never just the testimony of the person it was used against. It is the pattern, the accumulation, the way the same story sounds when you hear it from 3 or 4 different angles and they all land in the same place. And that is where we're heading next. For now, stay with the image of a woman in a warm room in Simi Valley, older and steadier than anyone expected, having outlasted both the show and the man who ran it. She earned that seat. She fought for it, quietly and privately, across 50 years. In the next chapter, we're going to look at the world that made all of this possible, and hear what the people standing nearby were willing to say about what they saw. There is something specific that happens when a powerful person in a closed system mistreats someone. The people who witness it develop a particular kind of memory. Not perfect, not complete, but shaped by the same architecture, the same careful awareness of where the power lives, the same instinct not to look directly at what is happening, the same habit of finding language that allows you to describe what you saw without fully naming it. That is the language the other witnesses on the Little House on the Prairie set eventually found their way toward. And when you listen to all of them together, not one voice, but several, across different memoirs and interviews separated by years, a picture emerges that is consistent in its outlines, even where the details differ. Karen Grassle was not imagining it, and she was not alone. Start with the money because the money is where the pattern is most visible. Alison Arngrim played Nellie Olson for 9 seasons. She was 12 years old when she was cast, utterly unknown, with no leverage and no agent who could have walked into a negotiation with any real power. She has said publicly that she felt respected by Landon. He treated her as someone whose work mattered, gave her real direction, took her seriously as a performer in a way that young actors on television were not always taken seriously. But she has also said this, plainly, in a 2004 interview. He was generous and stingy. We'd get these fabulous Christmas presents. But he also ran the tightest ship in town. There are many actors in Little House who will complain to you bitterly that they were underpaid. Read that twice. A man who gives you a stereo at Christmas and then makes sure the show consistently comes in under budget by keeping every actor's salary as low as the negotiation will allow. Those two things coexist easily in a specific kind of powerful person, the one who controls resources and uses them selectively, generously where it earns loyalty and tightly where it demonstrates authority. Charlotte Stewart, who played schoolteacher Eva Beadle through season 4, put it even more plainly. Landon's strategy, she explained, was to hire theatre actors and modestly credentialed television performers, people like Karen Grassle, not because they were the best available, but because their lack of television-specific market power made them easier to pay less. Kevin Hagen, who played Doc Baker across many seasons, said publicly that they got us cheap. There is nothing accidental about that. A man who simultaneously controls the creative output of a show, its budget, and its casting decisions can construct a salary structure that systematically favours himself. And in the 1970s, there was no industry mechanism with the real teeth that prevented exactly that. Now move to the behaviour on set, which is harder to verify from the outside but consistently described by those who were there. Melissa Sue Anderson played Mary Ingalls for nearly the full run of the series. Her relationship with Landon was more complicated than the warm accounts that Melissa Gilbert gave. Gilbert, who arrived on set as a child and essentially grew up under Landon's creative roof, has always described him as a father figure, protective and loving toward her in ways that clearly shaped her entire perception of the show. Anderson's account is cooler. She has said that Landon could joke on people, sometimes behind their back, and he could hurt them. And then, me specifically, Karen has talked about it too. 4 words. Karen has talked about it too. That is not a dramatic accusation. It is something quieter, and in some ways more damning. A quiet acknowledgement, from someone who was present, that what Karen described was not an invention, and was not unique to a single difficult day. It was a pattern, witnessed, remembered. What makes this harder to process, for many people who loved the show as children, is that none of these witnesses describe a straightforwardly cruel man. Karen herself does not. Alison Arngrim does not. Melissa Sue Anderson does not. The picture that emerges from all of their accounts combined is of a man who was genuinely talented, who worked harder than almost anyone else on that set, who was often funny and often warm, who cared deeply about what the show was doing culturally and took that responsibility seriously, and who also ran the tightest ship in town, kept actors cheap, could joke behind people's backs and hurt them, made crude sexual remarks in professional settings, and used his directorial and writing power to shrink the screen presence of the woman who had asked him to be paid fairly. Both things, at the same time, in the same person. That is not a comfortable place for an audience to sit. We are trained by the stories we tell about villains to expect them to be villainous all the way through. Cold, calculating, obviously malicious. Real power doesn't usually work like that. Real power is often warm and funny and generous, until the exact moment it needs to demonstrate that it is still power. i.e., you need to understand the legal and institutional landscape of that period to understand why none of this produced a formal complaint, a lawsuit, or even a public statement until decades later. The 1963 Equal Pay Act theoretically prohibited wage discrimination based on sex. Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act extended that protection to the broader workplace. On paper, Karen Grassle had legal standing. The show was a hit. She was a lead actress. The pay gap between her and Landon was not a minor disparity. It was, in the most generous reading of the available figures, an order of magnitude difference in total compensation across the same production period. But on paper is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The entertainment industry had, and to a significant degree still has, a set of structural features that make those legal protections extremely difficult to use in practice. Salaries were individually negotiated and kept confidential. Market rate justifications allowed producers to explain any pay gap as a function of star power rather than discrimination, since Landon did have significantly more established star power when the show began. Complaints had to be filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a process that was slow, uncertain, and very public in an industry where your next job depended on not being labelled difficult. And underlying all of it was the simplest and most durable enforcement mechanism of all. Karen needed the work. She was in her 30s, newly established in television, in a role that millions of viewers had come to associate specifically with her face. If she filed a complaint, the story became about the complaint, not the discrimination. If she walked off the show, she walked into an industry that would tell the story of why she left, in a way that served Michael Landon's interests, not hers. So she stayed, and she was quiet. And for 30 years after she left, she was still quiet. This is the part where the second-wave feminist context matters, and it is worth staying with for more than a paragraph. By 1975, the year of the salary dispute, the feminist movement in America was arguably at its most publicly visible moment in the 20th century. The Equal Rights Amendment had passed Congress in 1972 and was in the process of state ratification. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique had been in print for 12 years and was in millions of households. Gloria Steinem was on magazine covers. Women were marching, litigating, and organising in ways that were reshaping the cultural conversation about what women were owed in the workplace. And yet, in Hollywood specifically, research published in the Journal of American History makes clear that the entertainment industry proved particularly resistant to structural change even during this period. Women directed less than a fraction of 1% of Hollywood feature films through most of the decade. Those who made inroads were regularly characterised in industry discourse as impossible, too emotional, unable to manage budgets, inappropriate for the logistical complexity of the director's chair. Television offered marginally more access, but the executive producer role, the role Landon held, remained overwhelmingly male, and the creative authority it conferred was rarely available to women at all. Karen Grassle understood all of this. She was not naive about what she was navigating. She was simultaneously an actress living these structural limitations in her professional life, and an activist trying to change them in public life, advocating for the ERA, co-writing and starring in Battered, lobbying for domestic violence shelters. That gap between the changes she was fighting for in the larger world and the conditions she was enduring in her specific workplace is one of the most telling details of this entire story. The feminist movement was marching outside the studio gate. Inside it, Izzy, one of the women most publicly associated with traditional American motherhood, was being paid a fraction of her male co-stars' earnings and silenced by a power structure that had no formal accountability to the law it was technically obligated to follow. There is one more piece of witness testimony that deserves its own space. Victor French had been Michael Landon's friend since their years working together before Little House. He played Isaiah Edwards, one of the most beloved supporting characters in the show's early seasons. His own account of joining the show is telling. Landon's offer came at a time when French had spent years playing villains and criminals, and the invitation to be part of Little House felt, in his words, like a rescue. He was loyal to Landon in a way that the others were not uniformly. He also left the show in season 4 due to creative differences with Landon, briefly pursued his own projects, and eventually returned. Even French, Landon's close friend and professional ally, found working under Landon's authority difficult enough to walk away from temporarily. That matters. Because it shows that the tension Karen experienced was not uniquely targeted at women who asked for raises. It was a feature of concentrated power itself. Landon held enough authority that even the people he liked could find themselves on the wrong side of a decision with no obvious recourse. For Karen, being on the wrong side came with the additional layer of gender, the crude jokes, the comparison to child actors, yet the societal expectation that she should absorb disrespect and call it the cost of doing business. For French, being on the wrong side was a creative disagreement between two men, resolvable by departure and return. He could leave and come back without his dignity being the price of the ticket. That asymmetry is the through line in every account we have of what happened on that set. Here is the question those accounts add up to. How does a show become the most comforting piece of television many Americans have ever watched? A show that genuinely helped people through grief and hardship and loneliness across 50 years, while simultaneously being a workplace where the woman at the centre of all that comfort was systematically underpaid, dismissed, mocked, and gradually edged out of her own storylines. The honest answer is that those two things are not in contradiction. They happen together all the time. The warmth that reaches through the screen is real. The performances that create it are real. The care that millions of viewers have felt, watching Caroline Ingalls steady her family through a hard winter or a terrible loss, that care was generated by a real woman doing real work with genuine skill. What the screen cannot show you is what it cost to produce it. Art and exploitation are not mutually exclusive. Beauty can come from places that are not beautiful, and sometimes the most loving image on the surface is built on a foundation that the people who built it were not allowed to talk about for decades. And we have spent 4 chapters building the structure of what happened. The training, the casting, the dispute, the retaliation, the years of endurance, the departure, the reconciliation, and the testimony of witnesses. What we have not yet examined is the show itself, not as a production, but as a cultural object. What Little House on the Prairie meant to the country that watched it, why it hit so hard, why it endured so long, and what it means that the woman who embodied its emotional centre was being treated as a background fixture for most of the years she was giving it life. That is what comes next. The story of what a show can do to a culture and what a culture does in return, and what gets lost in the space between the image people love and the reality they never see. In 2024, A Nielsen report quietly confirmed something that surprised a lot of people who had assumed the story of Little House on the Prairie was safely in the past. The show accumulated 13 billion, 300 million minutes of streaming time in a single year, not across its entire history, in 1 year. To put that number in some kind of human scale, it is roughly equivalent to 1.5 million people watching the entire series from beginning to end, one episode each day, for 7 months. This happened in 2024, 50 years after the pilot aired, more than 40 years after the final episode, more than 30 years after Michael Landon's death, and 3 years after Karen Grassle published her memoir describing how the show's production had actually worked behind its warm exterior. People are not returning to this show out of ignorance. Many of them are returning to it knowing at least the broad outline of what happened, and they are watching anyway, in numbers that dwarf almost every piece of original streaming content produced that year. That tells you something important about what Little House on the Prairie actually is, not just what it was. And it raises a question that the story of Karen Grassle makes impossible to avoid. How do you hold both things at once? The real comfort the show provides, and the real cost it extracted from the woman at its centre? To understand why the show landed so hard in the first place, you have to stand in the America of September 1974, not the one that exists in the soft-focused nostalgia of retrospectives, but the actual one. The actual one is exhausted. 2 months earlier, Richard Nixon had resigned from the presidency in disgrace, the first American president ever to do so, after 2 years of Watergate hearings had made it impossible for ordinary people to watch the news without feeling that something fundamental about public trust had been broken. The Vietnam War's formal American involvement had ended in January 1973, but its psychological weight was still soaking through the culture, into the marriages of returning veterans, into the political language of a generation that had lost its confidence in official accounts of anything, into the art and music and journalism of a country trying to figure out what it believed. The economy was contracting. The OPEC oil embargo of 1973 had produced fuel shortages and long lines at gas stations. Inflation was rising. The economic certainty of the post-war boom was visibly cracking. And into that specific bruised, disoriented moment, NBC put a show on the air about a family that built things with their own hands, told the truth, loved their neighbours, and faced every disaster without dishonesty. The values the show celebrated, in the specific framing offered by Politico in 2025, were fairness, integrity, neighbourliness, and the importance of community, apolitical tenets to which we could all aspire. The Ingalls family's honesty was set against the backdrop of Gerald Ford's explicit promise of openness and candour upon assuming the presidency, which means the show and the political moment were in direct conversation whether Landon intended it or not. Little House was not an escape from America. It was a version of America that people desperately needed to believe still existed somewhere. Now consider what that meant for the character of Caroline Ingalls specifically. Ma is not simply a supporting role in the Ingalls family structure. She is the emotional temperature of the house. When she's calm, the children can breathe. When she's frightened, the whole family feels it. When she's proud, the scene carries weight that Pa's dialogue alone cannot generate. Television critics who have analysed the show note that Karen Grassle brought to Caroline, something the books themselves did not fully provide. A quiet, visible, internal life. The fictional Ma in Laura Ingalls Wilder's original novels is drawn largely from the outside, seen through a child's admiring eyes, and described in terms of what she does and how she looks and sounds. The television Ma, in Grassle's hands, became a woman with something going on behind her eyes that you could not always name but could always feel. One analysis of the character describes Caroline constantly gauging the moods of everyone around her, calculating how best to avoid conflict, suppressing her own emotional responses to remain the stable centre, scolding herself internally for any crack in her composure, because displaying your feelings was considered unseemly, indulgent and attention-seeking. Read that description, and then hold it next to what you already know about the actress playing her. A woman suppressing what she actually feels in order to maintain a steady professional surface. A woman who has learned to absorb what is being done to her without letting it show. because showing it costs more than swallowing it. A woman whose inner life is invisible to the audience but fully present in the performance. Karen Grassle did not have to fabricate Caroline Ingalls from scratch. She was, in some meaningful sense, living a version of her. This is where the paradox of the show becomes almost unbearable to look at directly. Little House on the Prairie premiered and sustained itself through most of its run as one of American television's most explicit celebrations of female strength. Not the kind of strength that gets celebrated in action sequences or boardroom negotiations, the kind that holds a family together through crop failure, blindness, death, poverty and isolation. The kind that requires constant, unacknowledged labour and produces no formal recognition. Ma is the reason the Ingalls family does not collapse. Every viewer who has watched more than 3 episodes knows this intuitively, even if the show's explicit narrative credit often goes to Pa, and the actress generating that portrayal of female strength and resilience was, for most of those 8 seasons, being systematically denied fair compensation, marginalised in her creative contributions, subjected to sexual humiliation in her workplace, and prevented from speaking about any of it by the same industry structures the feminist movement was fighting to dismantle. There is a word for that kind of arrangement. It is not a gentle word, but the most accurate description of what was happening is this. America watched a weekly tribute to the dignity and strength of a working mother, funded in part by keeping the woman performing that tribute in conditions that directly contradicted everything the character stood for. What makes this more than just a story about one actress and one powerful man is the sheer universality of the pattern. Ask the women in your life, the ones who watched this show growing up, the ones who are watching it now with their own children or their grandchildren, whether they recognise the shape of what Karen Grassle experienced. The job where you worked harder and more carefully than everyone around you and were paid less, promoted later, and acknowledged less completely. The boss who was charming in public and quietly dismissive in private. The meeting where your idea was ignored until a man said the same thing and everyone nodded. The choice between speaking up and keeping the work that paid your rent. These are not edge cases. They are the ordinary texture of working life for millions of American women in the 1970s, and to varying degrees now. Karen Grassle's story is specific to Hollywood, to that set, to that man. But its architecture is something that 90% of the women watching this video will recognise from their own professional lives, in their own industries, in their own towns. That is why the memoir sold. That is why the interviews got traction. That is why, when she sat down for a Parade interview in late 2025 and talked about resentment and anger toward Landon, the story spread across every major entertainment platform within hours. People were not surprised. They were relieved that someone had finally said it plainly. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The character of Caroline Ingalls, as written in the original Laura Ingalls Wilder novels, is not particularly complex. She is patient, devout, proper, occasionally stiff. She exists largely as a contrast to the wilder, more adventurous spirit of Prairie and young Laura. She is, in the books, a type more than a person. What Karen Grassle did over 8 seasons, quietly, without anyone asking her to, in the margins of scripts that gave her less and less to work with over time, was build a woman out of that type. The small moment where Ma's face tightens before she smooths it. The pause before she answers Pa when she disagrees but chooses not to start a fight she knows won't end well. The way she touches a child's face in a scene where the script just says comforts. The specific quality of that touch, the weight of it, the thing it communicates about a woman who has been comforting people since before she had the strength to do it easily. None of that is in the script. All of that is in the performance. And the woman delivering it was, for most of those years, doing it while running on fumes, fighting her way through alcoholism and depression, and arriving on set every morning in a costume that represented the exact opposite of how she was being treated. There is one more dimension of the cultural story that deserves attention here, because it complicates the show's legacy in a way that Karen's personal story alone doesn't capture. Little House on the Prairie did not just reflect America's values, it shaped them. Academic analysis of the show has consistently noted its role in constructing a specific mythology of American self-reliance. The idea that a family with enough determination, enough faith, and enough love can make it through anything without institutional support. That mythology is enormously appealing. It is also, as historians of the American West have pointed out, not entirely accurate to the historical record. The real Ingalls family was, in fact, as one University of Colorado analysis put it, a pioneer family who worked very hard, sacrificed a great deal, and still remained trapped in failure through much of their early history. The show's version softened those edges considerably, and yet the mythology landed hard and deep in a culture that needed it. It told people that the values of an earlier America, honesty, community, hard physical work, faith, were worth preserving and capable of solving almost any problem the modern world could generate. That message was politically useful to a wide range of people in the 1970s and beyond. It has been claimed and reclaimed across decades by different political movements for different purposes. What gets lost in every iteration of that cultural conversation is the specific woman who gave the myth its warmth. Not Laura, who was the show's protagonist and whose adventurousness drove most of its narrative energy. Ma, the steady one, the quiet one. The one who made the house feel like home even when the world outside it was trying to take everything the family had. She made it feel real, and the person who made her feel real was being paid a fraction of what the man playing her husband was paid, for work that was indispensable to the emotional engine of everything the show produced. There is a version of this story that ends here, with the cultural paradox neatly laid out and the audience left to draw their own conclusions. But that would leave out the most important question. Not what happened, not who was responsible, but what it means, now, in 2026, when the show is still being watched in numbers that outperform almost everything else streaming on television. When Karen Grassle is 83 years old and living in Italy, and has said everything she needed to say about those 8 seasons, and when the cultural conversation about workplace power and gender, and who gets to tell what story has shifted in ways that the women marching for the ERA in 1975 could not entirely have anticipated. What does this particular story add to that conversation? What does it tell us that we do not already know? The answer to that is what the next chapter is for. Because the reason Karen Grassle's story still resonates, still spreads, still gets picked up, still makes women in their 40s and 50s and 60s say, "Yes, I knew it, I felt it when I watched the show," is not just that it is a story about the past, it is a story about the present, about the particular and persistent cost of asking to be paid fairly in a structure that was not built to hear that request from you, about the long, private work of turning resentment into something that doesn't eat you alive, about what it means to make something beautiful and enduring in conditions that were, for much of the time, neither. And about why the woman who did that is sitting in Italy now, at peace, while 13 billion minutes of her work play across screens in homes she will never see, carrying warmth she generated into families who have no idea what it cost her. She gave them Ma. All she wanted in return was to be paid what she was worth. Here is a number that has never appeared on any press release about Little House on the Prairie. Approximately $1.27. That is what Karen Grassle receives per episode in residuals from the show's current streaming, $1.27 per episode, from a show that accumulated 13 billion minutes of streaming time in 2024 alone. The contract she signed in the early 1970s, before streaming existed, before the concept of digital rights had entered the legal vocabulary of the entertainment industry, before anyone could have predicted that a network drama about a 19th century frontier family would still be generating revenue half a century later, locked her into a residual structure that was already modest by the standards of its time, and is, by the standards of ours, essentially nothing. The show is worth more now, culturally and commercially, than it was during its original run. The woman who gave it its emotional centre earns $1.27 per episode every time someone clicks play. That is not a footnote. That is the story. Let's place that number next to what we already know about the arc of Karen Grassle's compensation. During the show's run, she earned approximately $600,000 total across 8 seasons. Michael Landon accumulated an estate of roughly $40 million by the time of his death in 1991, an accumulation built substantially on the same show. The wage gap between them during production was already wide enough to be shocking. The residual structure after production has made it permanent. Every year the show continues to stream. The economic architecture of that original contract plays out again, quietly, with no ceremony, in the form of a payment so small it functions less like compensation than like a reminder of what the original deal was: $1.27. For context, in 2024, Netflix paid top creators residuals that could run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per quarter for shows with comparable streaming numbers. The contracts that protect those creators are the result of decades of negotiation by SAG-AFTRA and the WGA, labour actions that were themselves motivated in part by the documented failure of earlier industry contracts to protect people exactly like Karen Grassle. The 2023 WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes, the most significant Hollywood labour action in decades, were at their core about closing the specific kind of gap that Karen's residuals represent. The gap between the value a performer's work generates and the value the performer actually receives when new distribution technologies arrive. She never got to benefit from any of that. The contract was already signed. The door was already closed. There is a particular kind of injustice that is invisible while it's happening, because it doesn't look like anything dramatic. It doesn't look like a confrontation. It doesn't produce a scene that anyone will remember. It is just a number on a page, a clause in a contract, a line item in an accounting structure that no one outside the business affairs department of a network will ever examine closely. Karen Grassle experienced that kind of injustice twice, or once in the salary negotiations of the mid-1970s, when the ask was for fair pay during production, and once in the residual structure that has governed what she receives from that work for the 50 years since. Both times, the mechanism was the same, a contract structure designed and enforced by people with more institutional power than she had. A legal framework that the people in the weaker position could push against but rarely overturn. A cultural norm that defined her refusal to accept the terms as difficult, while defining the people who set the terms as simply businesslike. Research published by the University of Huddersfield found that in Hollywood, female stars earn on average roughly 56% less per project than their male counterparts with comparable experience. That figure accounts for negotiation quality, agency representation, and market factors. Even with all of those variables controlled for, the gap remains statistically significant and consistent across decades. Karen Grassle's situation was not an outlier. It was an example, a high-visibility, well-documented example of a structural condition that has operated across the industry for as long as the industry has existed. What changed in 2017 is worth understanding precisely, because it explains the specific timing of when Karen finally told her story in full. The #MeToo movement, as it moved through Hollywood in the fall of that year, did something that legal frameworks and union contracts had not fully managed to do in the preceding decades. It shifted the social cost of silence. Before 2017, the social cost of speaking, being labelled difficult, being passed over for future work, having your credibility challenged by the institutional power of the people you were describing, was higher for most women than the social cost of staying quiet. After 2017, that calculus began to change, not completely, not uniformly, but enough that women who had been carrying private accounts of professional harm for years began to feel that the ground was different enough to hold the weight of disclosure. Karen Grassle was not a #MeToo case in the legal or procedural sense. She is not describing assault. She is describing systematic economic discrimination, a hostile work environment, and the long psychological cost of living inside both. But the cultural shift that #MeToo produced, the shift that made it possible to say publicly that a beloved, powerful man had behaved badly without having the entire conversation collapse into attacks on the woman's motives and memory, is part of what made Bright Lights. prairie dust possible. She had been holding her account for decades. The moment when the world was ready to hear it arrived, and she used it. The response to the memoir is instructive. When it was published in November 2021, it received coverage across virtually every major entertainment platform. The reception, broadly, divided along two lines. The first was the line of recognition. Women who had watched the show as children and were now in their 40s, 50s, and 60s read the memoir and wrote about the experience of having the intuition they had always carried, that something was slightly wrong in the dynamic between Ma and Pa that the show never fully explained, confirmed and given language. They had felt it. They hadn't been able to name it. Now they could. The second line was more uncomfortable. The defenders of Landon's legacy who argued that the memoir was unfair to a man who could not respond, that Grassle's memories were coloured by bitterness, that the generosity he showed to others on the set should weigh against her specific account of how he treated her. Both of those responses are worth taking seriously, but for different reasons. The defenders are not entirely wrong that Landon's complexity matters. He was, by the accounts of many people who knew him, genuinely talented and often genuinely kind. The fact that he could be both kind and cruel, generous to some and withholding to others, is not a contradiction in his character. It is his character, and it is the character of a specific kind of power that distributes its warmth strategically and its cruelty quietly. Karen herself has been careful, throughout every interview since the memoir's publication, to hold both of those things at once. In a Fox News interview in late 2021, she said directly, "To my dying day, I will never really understand why he dug his heels and refused as he did. After a year and a half or so, I did get an excellent contract that was appropriate for the time. It meant a lot to me, but I paid a heavy price for it. I just wanted a fair wage." That sentence is the whole story in miniature, not rage, not self-pity, not a revised version of events that makes her blameless and him a monster. Just the plain statement of a woman who wanted a fair wage, got one eventually, and paid for asking with years of her professional and personal life. Here is where the story stops being about the past and starts being about right now. In 2025, the entertainment industry is nominally more equitable than it was in 1975. There are pay transparency provisions in some states. SAG-AFTRA residual structures are significantly better for work produced under new contracts than they were under the contracts Karen signed. The Oscars, the Emmys, and the major trade publications track gender representation in ways they simply did not in the 1970s. And yet, research published through The Conversation in 2023 documents that women in media who took legal action over pay and equity in the 1970s often found themselves professionally sidelined by their employers, even when they won. Women reported missing out on future jobs once prospective employers found out about a lawsuit. Some left the industry entirely. The pattern of retaliation for asserting fair pay, not just in entertainment, but in media broadly, persisted across decades and persists to a documented degree today. The difference between then and now is not that the structural problem has been solved. It is that the people experiencing the structural problem are more likely to be believed when they describe it, and slightly less likely to be professionally destroyed for describing it. Slightly less likely, not immune. What Karen Grassle chose to do with that shift is worth examining as a piece of evidence about what it actually takes for this kind of disclosure to happen. She was 78 years old when she began the public conversation, retired, effectively, from the kind of career exposure that made silence a professional survival strategy during her working years, sober, which gave her a clarity and a groundedness she has said was essential to being able to tell the story honestly rather than through the distorting lens of self-protection or resentment. She had also done the internal work, the forgiveness of Landon before his death, the letter written in the late 1980s that untangled her enough from the hurt to stop letting it run her life. The memoir is not an act of revenge. It is the opposite. It is the act of a woman who has already processed what happened to her privately and is now choosing to make the account public, not to damage Landon's legacy, but to use her own experience as evidence for a conversation that is larger than her specific situation. She says it directly in interviews. She hopes the book is useful to younger women navigating similar structures, similar choices, similar moments when the ask for fair treatment meets the wall of institutional resistance. That instinct, to turn private pain into public usefulness, is something the women watching this video will recognise as profoundly female in its orientation. Not because women are inherently more altruistic, but because women have for a very long time been put in positions where the most effective thing they can do with their experience is turn it into something that helps the people coming behind them. There is a specific detail about Karen Grassle's post-Little House financial life that does not appear in most of the coverage of her memoir, but that the outline of this story makes visible if you look closely. In 2025, People magazine reported that she has moved to Italy, reconnecting with a man she knew long before the Prairie, building a life in a country she had fallen in love with during her years of theatre work. She's 82. She is, by every account that has reached the public record, genuinely at peace. Not performing peace, not projecting contentment for an audience, actually there. And yet, the economic terms of her work on Little House have not changed. The $27 is still $27. The $600,000 she earned across 8 seasons is still the number it is, measured against the $40 million on the other side of the ledger. Forgiveness does not retroactively correct a contract. Peace does not rewrite the accounting. A life well lived at 82 does not erase the years in the middle, when the cost of staying professional was higher than it should have been for any human being doing any job. What it does do is something different, and, in its own way, more powerful. It demonstrates that the woman who was told she wasn't worth very much, who was measured against child actors and found equivalent, who sat in a makeup chair absorbing humiliations she couldn't rebuke without risking her livelihood, that woman outlasted the conditions that diminished her. She built a life that is recognisably and entirely hers. She told her own story in her own words on her own timeline, and the world was ready to hear it. The $27 is still $27. But she is the one sitting in Italy. She is the one with the memoir. She is the one whose version of 50 years of television history is now part of the public record. That is not justice exactly, but it is something real, something that matters, something worth staying all the way to the end of this story to understand. So which brings us to the final chapter, not a summary, not a verdict. Something harder and more honest than either of those things. An accounting of what it means. Not just for Karen Grassle, not just for Hollywood, not just for the women who watch the show and recognise something unnamed in their gut, but for all of us who have ever consumed something beautiful without asking what it cost the person who made it. What we owe, what we miss when we look only at the screen, and what it means that a woman in Italy is living proof that surviving is possible, and that telling the truth is worth it, and that the part of the story that gets told last is sometimes the truest part of all. There is a city in northern Italy called Carrara, where the marble comes from. Not the decorative kind, the real kind, the dense, heavy, almost luminous white stone that Michelangelo walked 17 days over the Apennine Mountains to select personally, because he believed the correct marble for a sculpture already contained the finished work inside it, and the sculptor's only job was to remove what didn't belong. In December 2025, Karen Grassle signed the paperwork on an apartment there. Carrara, a city of sculptors and stone dust and narrow streets that have not changed much in several hundred years. A city where a man named Robert Gove, an American sculptor, has been living and working for more than 4 decades. A man Karen first fell in love with when she was a teenager in Berkeley, before London, before Broadway, before the Prairie, before all of it. They found each other again through an email she'd decided on a quiet morning to send. "How would you like a visitor?" That was the message. 6 words. They met up. They fell back in love. She's 83 years old. The woman who was told she wasn't worth very much, at the beginning of all of this, is living part-time in a city that has spent 5 centuries teaching people to find what survives inside a block of stone. If that is not the right place for the end of this story, there is no right place. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's earn the ending. Because between where we left off, the $27, the residual structure, the way economic injustice compounds quietly across decades, and the apartment in Carrara, there is a gap that deserves to be filled carefully. The gap is not about events. It is about what Karen chose to do with time. After the memoir, after the interviews, after the public conversation that Bright Light's Prairie Dust opened in late 2021, something shifted in her relationship with the show, and with the audience the show had given her, for years, going back to the most difficult period on set and continuing through the decades after she left. Karen had kept her distance from the fan community that had grown up around Little House, not with hostility, simply with the kind of space a person needs when a thing they are associated with is also a thing that hurt them. You know that feeling, perhaps, from your own life. A job you were proud of that became something you cannot think about without the pride and the pain arriving together, inseparable, neither cancelling the other out. A place you loved that is also the place where something was taken from you. The way memory doesn't file things neatly. For Karen, the show was all of that at once. She has said in interviews that she separated herself from fans and from Little House events for years because being there brought everything back simultaneously. The good work and the difficult conditions, the character she built with such care and the environment in which she built it. She could not access one without accessing the other. The memoir changed that, not because telling the story erased the difficult parts, but because telling it publicly, in full, gave the two halves of the experience their proper weight. The pride no longer had to coexist silently with the pain. Both were now in the air, spoken, documented, part of the record. And that shift from private holding to public naming freed her to return. In March 2024, Karen Grassle attended the Little House on the Prairie 50th Anniversary Cast Reunion and Festival in Simi Valley, California, the same general location where the original series was filmed. The event ran across 3 days. Karen was there alongside Alison Arngrim, Charlotte Stewart, Dean Butler, the Greenbush twins, and others. People who had shared those years on the Prairie set, who carried their own complicated memories of the same time and place. She signed autographs. She sat for photographs with fans who had waited, some of them for decades, to be in the same room with the woman who had played Ma. She participated in Q&A sessions where people asked the kinds of questions that fans ask when they have loved something their entire lives, what it was really like, what she remembered, what she was proudest of. Then in December 2025, she was there again, a second reunion, this one running from December 12th through the 14th back in Simi Valley. Alison Arngrim, Charlotte Stewart, Rachel and Sydney Greenbush, Dean Butler, and a larger cast than the first event came together for an immersive 3-day celebration that included a screening of a new feature-length documentary called Little House Homecoming. That she was there at all, present, warm, engaged, signing autographs and sitting in Q&A panels and looking genuinely glad to be in that company, is not a small thing. This is a woman who spent decades unable to be fully present at these kinds of events because of what she was carrying. She showed up anyway when the time was right, and when the time was more right, she showed up more fully. Here is what those reunion images tell us, if you are willing to look at them for what they are rather than for what the nostalgia industry wants them to be. They tell us that the human capacity for holding complexity is larger than we usually give it credit for. Karen Grassle can sit in the same room with the memories of the salary dispute, the crude jokes, the shrinking screen time, the years of depression and alcoholism, and the long fight back to sobriety, and also be genuinely glad to see Alison Arngrim, genuinely moved by the fans who are holding their childhood copies of a show she helped build, genuinely proud of the work that came out of those 8 difficult, important years. Not one or the other, both, all of it, in the same room, in the same afternoon. The capacity to hold that kind of complexity without collapsing into either bitterness or denial is something most people spend a lifetime learning. Some never learn it at all. They simplify. They choose one feeling and make it the only feeling, because holding all of them at once is exhausting and imprecise and resistant to the clean narrative that the world keeps asking for. Karen chose the harder thing. She chose all of it. For the women watching this, and you're the majority of the room tonight, there is something in that choice that deserves a moment of direct attention. We are very often asked to simplify the things that have hurt us, to decide cleanly whether someone was good or bad, to locate the story of our own professional injury in the category of resolved or unresolved, forgiven or still processing. The culture wants clean categories. Workplaces, legal systems, and social media all run better with clean categories. But the truth of most women's working lives does not fit into clean categories. The job you were proud of that also diminished you, the colleague who championed your work in one meeting and undermined you in the next, the institution you believed in that turned out to believe in you contingently, warmly, as long as you didn't ask for too much. Karen Grassle's story is not an outlier. It is an unusually well-documented version of something millions of women have lived in ordinary circumstances without cameras or residuals or a hit memoir, and have had to process privately, without the validation of public recognition. What she did with her version, the memoir, the interviews, the willingness to return to the room where it happened and stand there as herself rather than as a character, is the kind of thing that teaches people how it's done. Not how to forgive a specific person, not how to speak publicly about a specific industry, but how to stay whole, how to refuse to let the worst version of an experience become the defining version. How to be the person who tells the story, rather than the story that gets told about the person. There is one more thing to say about Michael Landon, and it is important to say it in this final chapter, rather than leaving it where it has been living, as a background presence in the story of the harm he caused. Michael Landon died in July 1991 of pancreatic cancer. He was 54 years old. The diagnosis came in April. He was gone in 3 months. By any account that has survived him, the weeks between the public announcement of his illness and his death were characterized by an outpouring of public love so large that it was in itself a kind of evidence about what his public work had meant to people. He gave a widely watched interview from his home, thin and clearly dying, in speaking with a directness about his own mortality that people found both devastating and admirable. He did not perform peace. He was simply honest about what was happening, which was consistent with how he had always worked, directly, without flinching away from difficult things. Karen had already done what she needed to do before that happened. The letter in the late 1980s, the untangling, the decision to release him from the space he had been occupying in her private life, not for his benefit, but for her own. She has described their reconciliation as genuine rather than performed. Something was actually sorted out. Something was actually in the end forgiven. What she has never done, and this matters, is use that forgiveness to revise the account. She has not said, in the light of his death or his public grief or his obvious talent or the love people had for his work, that what he did to her was acceptable. She has not recanted. She has not softened the facts to fit the mythology. She has simply held both things, the forgiveness and the facts, side by side, neither cancelling the other. Let's talk about what the legacy actually is, now that we can see the whole arc. Little House on the Prairie will keep streaming. The numbers suggest it will keep growing, not shrinking, as new generations discover it and bring the show to their children the way their grandmothers brought it to them. New conversations about its historical accuracy, its treatment of Native American characters, its romanticization of westward expansion will continue. Those are necessary conversations, and scholars and educators are having them carefully. The show's complicated political legacy, claimed at different moments by people across the ideological spectrum, used as evidence for wildly different arguments about what American family values actually require, will also continue. None of that changes what Karen Grassle contributed to the show's emotional power. None of it changes what it cost her. And none of it changes the fact that the most durable part of her legacy is not the character, as beloved as that character is. The most durable part is the account. Bright lights, Prairie dust is now part of the historical record of American television. It will be read alongside the show's production history in any serious examination of how that show was actually made. It will be cited in academic work on gender equity in the entertainment industry. It will be found by women 20 years from now who are navigating their own versions of the same architecture, looking for evidence that what they are experiencing is real, and that speaking about it is possible. That is not a small legacy. That is, in fact, a more lasting kind of impact than a credit on a call sheet. And then there is the apartment in Carrara. A sculptor named Robert Gove, who has spent more than 40 years working in Italian marble, living in a city where the stone is so fine it has been prized for centuries by people who understood that the difference between ordinary material and extraordinary material is worth travelling very far to find. A woman who sent an email that said, in 6 words, how would you like a visitor? A gamble, a reunion, a small apartment in a city of stone. She plans to split her time between Italy and the United States. She continues to be in touch with her castmates. She continues, in her own quiet way, to be present in the conversation about what the show was and what it meant and what it actually cost the people who made it beautiful. At 83, Karen Grassle is not a woman in the final chapters of her life. She's a woman who has lived enough to know the difference between ending and completing, between a story that simply runs out of time and a story that arrives, carefully and on its own terms, at a place that feels like wholeness. She earned the right to that distinction. Not easily, not quickly, not without loss, but she earned it. Tonight, you have followed her from a house in Berkeley where a girl learned to read adults the way others read books, to a stage in London where she learned to make words carry weight, to a set in Simi Valley where she made something beloved at a cost that took 50 years to fully name. You have stood with her in a makeup trailer while a man in power reduced her to a punchline. You have sat with her through the long middle years of alcoholism and recovery and the invisible work of forgiving someone who held more cards than you did. You have watched her walk back into a room full of complicated memories and choose, deliberately, to be whole. And now you can leave her where she is, in a city of sculptors, in an apartment she signed for herself, with a man she first loved 60 years ago, before any of the Prairie existed, before the costume and the camera and the contract and the crude jokes and the raised and lowered screen time and the $27 and the memoir and the reunion. Before all of it, there was a girl in Berkeley who loved words and stages and the specific feeling of a line landing in a quiet room. She is still there. She never left. Everything else was the work, and the work was, in the end, is what survives. If this story found you somewhere in your own life tonight, in a memory of a job that asked too much for too little, in the face of someone who once held too much power over your days, then let it settle gently where it lands. You don't have to resolve anything tonight. You don't have to untangle everything. Sometimes the most useful thing a story can do is simply confirm that what you felt was real, that what you endured had a name, that other people carried similar weight and came through it whole. That is what Karen Grassle's story offers. Not a solution, a witness. And sometimes that is the most important thing in the world. Sleep well. The work continues tomorrow and you are more than enough to meet it. If this story stayed with you, there is more waiting. The next chapter begins whenever you're ready.